My name is Jack, and I have always been a cautious person, preferring to stay out of trouble. One day, while sitting in my house in Chicago, I heard a strange sound coming from the basement. Nothing special. Probably a mouse, I thought, and decided to check out what was going on. As I walked down the creaky stairs, I felt the cold creeping under my skin. In the dim light, I noticed a thin strip of light coming through a small crack in the wall. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked closer. Suddenly, the strip of light widened, and I discovered a secret door. Who would have thought that there was a secret room in my house? My heart started beating faster. I carefully opened the door and saw a narrow corridor leading into darkness. The smell of damp and rot hit my nose. I took the flashlight and started moving forward, carefully examining the walls covered with old newspaper clippings and strange symbols. My imagination painted the most terrible pictures, but I could not stop. After a few minutes, I reached the end of the corridor where I found another door, behind which I could hear quiet rustling. With difficulty controlling my shaking hands, I opened the door and found myself in a small room filled with various tools and strange objects. On the table lay maps and photographs of people with frozen expressions of horror on their faces. My blood ran cold when I recognized one of them. It was my neighbor John, who had disappeared several months ago. At that moment, I heard footsteps behind me. I quickly turned around and saw a man in a dark hood quietly watching me. His eyes glittered with hatred. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, taking a step forward. I felt fear grip my body, but the instinct for self-preservation took over. I rushed to the exit, but he managed to grab my hand. I struggled with all my might, but he was stronger. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder. The knife had entered my flesh. A cry of despair escaped my lips as I realized that my chances of salvation were fading with each passing second. He whispered something in my ear, but I could not make out the words, too blinded by fear and pain. Suddenly, he let go of me and I staggered out of the room. My only thought was to get to the phone and call the police, but I didn't know how much time I had left. Stumbling and leaving a trail of blood behind me, I made it to the living room and grabbed the phone. I dialed 911 and tried to stay on my feet, feeling the darkness before my eyes. "Please help, I'm under attack!" I gasped into the phone. The operator began asking questions, but I felt myself losing consciousness. My strength was running out. I heard the operator say that help was on the way, but would I survive until they arrived? My mind went blank and I collapsed to the floor, losing consciousness. I woke up in a hospital. Doctors and nurses were all around. They told me I was lucky to be alive. The police found me in time. They said they had found evidence in my house that the man was a serial killer who had been terrorizing our city for years. But they hadn't caught him. He had disappeared, leaving behind only a shadow of horror. I tried to return to normal life, but the nightmares would not go away. I knew that he was out there somewhere, and maybe one day he would come back for me. In every rustle, in every shadow, I saw his figure. But I decided that I would no longer be a victim. I began to train and study self-defense, preparing for the day when our paths would cross again. It had been months since I had woken up in the hospital, and although the physical wounds had healed, the psychological ones still tormented me. Every night, as I fell asleep, I returned to that dark room, hearing his whispers and feeling a sharp pain in my shoulder. But I knew I had to go on living. One evening, when I returned home from work, I noticed that the door to my house was ajar. I knew I had locked it that morning. My heart began to beat faster, but I did not panic. Trying to make no noise, I took out of my pocket a small knife that I had always carried with me since the attack, and carefully entered. The house was quiet. I checked every room, but I didn't find anything unusual. Maybe it was just my imagination. But when I approached the kitchen, I saw a note on the table. It had only one word: soon. My hand shook as I held the piece of paper. He was here again. I immediately called the police, but they couldn't find any signs of a break-in or any evidence that could help catch the maniac. They said they would patrol the area, but I knew that wouldn't stop him. He was too smart to get caught that easily. I decided to install security cameras around my house and bought a few extra locks for the doors just in case. Every night I woke up at the slightest noise, ready to defend myself. But nothing happened, and I began to think that maybe he decided to leave me alone. A month passed and I began to calm down a little. The evenings were getting cooler, and I decided to take a walk in the park to clear my head. Deep down, I was still afraid, but I didn't want fear to rule my life. As I walked along the illuminated alley, I noticed that someone was watching me. I quickened my pace, trying not to look back, but this feeling of being watched was getting stronger. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, and my heart started pounding again. I stopped and turned around, but all I saw were the shadows of trees. My paranoia was growing stronger with each passing minute. When I got home, I decided to look at the surveillance footage. Nothing suspicious had happened for several nights, but one recording gave me the creeps. In one of the videos, I noticed a figure in a dark hood standing at the corner of my yard, watching my house closely. I realized that this nightmare would never end until I found him and stopped him myself. The police were useless, and I had to take matters into my own hands. I began to study all the available materials about serial killers, their behavior and methods. I was ready for decisive action. I decided to be more cunning. Every evening I pretended to leave the house, but in reality I hid nearby and watched my house. A week passed, and then one night when I was sitting in the shade of the trees, I saw him. The hooded man appeared at my house again. I knew this was my chance. I knew the time had come. But instead of attacking him directly, I decided to use a more cunning plan. I quickly and quietly returned to the house, leaving the doors and windows as they were. I quickly packed a few essentials into a small backpack and turned on the alarm I had recently installed. I climbed out the back door, carefully closed it, and headed into the woods that started right behind my house. I had a pre-planned route map that would take me to an abandoned house deep in the woods. The house hadn't been visited in years, so I decided to use it as a temporary shelter. It was dark and cold in the forest. The tree branches crunched under my feet, but I kept going despite my fear. I understood that this was my only chance for salvation. I had left a note in the house with false information that I had gone to another city, hoping to confuse the maniac. When I reached the abandoned house, I barricaded the entrance and checked the windows. It was cold and damp inside, but I found an old stove that I managed to light to keep warm. I sat in the corner listening to every sound outside the windows, trying to catch the slightest sign of danger. I spent a couple of days in this shelter, leaving only at night to check on the situation and stock up on food from the nearest store. I knew I couldn't hold out for long, but it gave me time to think about what to do next. I contacted a childhood friend who lived in another state and asked for help. My friend Mike was an ex-military man and knew exactly how to handle such situations. We agreed to meet in a small town on the state line where I could stay for a while. To avoid attracting attention, I decided to leave the abandoned house at night, taking advantage of the darkness. I made a long way through the forest, trying to avoid main roads and populated areas. Eventually, I reached the designated meeting place. Mike was waiting for me on the side of the road in his old Jeep. We exchanged brief greetings, and he helped me load my things into the car. As we set off, I felt relieved. But the tension inside me didn't go away. I knew the maniac wouldn't give in so easily. Mike took me to his house, where I was able to relax a little and regain my strength. We discussed my plan and decided to act in stages. The first thing we decided to do was find a safe place for me, where I could remain visible but still be protected. Mike contacted some of his former colleagues, and they agreed to help us. We found a small house in the middle of nowhere that could be used as a temporary shelter. After moving to a new house, I began to plan my life anew. Mike and his friends helped me install a security system, and I felt more secure, but I knew I couldn't stay in this hideout forever. My goal was to find the maniac and stop him from stalking me once, and I started a new life in the house Mike provided. The place was quiet and secluded, but I always felt that the maniac would not rest until he found me. Mike and his friends helped me install cameras around the house and motion sensors so that I always knew what was happening around me. Every day I trained and studied all possible scenarios. I knew I had to be prepared for anything. In my free time, I studied materials about serial killers, analyzed their behavior and methods in order to predict the next move of my stalker. One day, while browsing the news, I came across an article about a recent murder in a nearby town. The method was very similar to the signature of the maniac who had been stalking me. It couldn't be a coincidence. He was on the hunt again and was closer than I thought. I knew it was time to act. I contacted Mike and shared my suspicions. We decided that we needed to draw attention to this case, but to act carefully so as not to scare off the maniac. Mike knew a reporter who specialized in crime investigations and arranged a meeting. We met the reporter in a small cafe away from crowded places. His name was Tom, and he was immediately interested in our story. We told him about the attack, about the secret room, and about how the maniac was still stalking me. Tom agreed to help, but warned that it would be dangerous. Tom began his investigation by gathering information on all recent murders that could be linked to our maniac. He also interviewed witnesses and relatives of the victims. He soon found patterns and confirmed our suspicions. The maniac was indeed active in this region. Realizing that we needed more evidence to get the police involved, we decided to set a trap. Mike suggested using me as bait to lure the maniac out. It was a risky plan, but we had no other choice. I agreed, realizing that this might be my only chance to end this nightmare. We came up with a plan of action. I was supposed to accidentally appear in a public place, knowing that the maniac would be watching me. Tom and Mike with their friends would watch and wait for the right moment to grab me. Everything had to go quickly and smoothly. The day arrived when we decided to carry out our plan. I went to a large shopping center trying to look as relaxed as possible. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I knew I had to stay calm. Mike, Tom, and their team were in position and ready to go. I was walking around the shops, pretending to pick out things, but I kept feeling someone's eyes on me. Suddenly, I noticed a hooded figure moving behind me. It was him. I continued on my way, heading towards the exit where our operation would unfold. As I approached the exit, the hooded figure quickened his pace. At that moment, Mike gave the signal, and his team surrounded the maniac. It all happened in a matter of seconds. He was grabbed and thrown to the ground. The maniac resisted fiercely, but Mike and his friends were well prepared. The police, whom Tom had warned in advance, arrived within minutes. The maniac was arrested and taken away, and I stood there, not believing that it was all over. After so many months of fear and persecution, I was finally free. Tom promised to write an article so that people would know the truth about those events. A few days later, I was sitting at Mike's house reading Tom's article. He described our entire story, all the maniac's victims, and how we caught him. It was not only my victory, but also the victory of everyone who suffered at his hands. I knew there would be a lot of work ahead, both physical and emotional, but I was ready for it. Life began to return to normal little by little. I tried to spend more time with friends and family, enjoying every moment. I knew I would never forget what happened, but I had learned to move on. And most importantly, I knew that justice had been served. All. A few weeks passed and life began to return to normal. However, I still felt the shadow of that terrible experience haunting me. One night I was awakened by a strange sound coming from the street. I carefully approached the window and saw a dark figure standing at the edge of the forest. My heart sank. Could it really be him again? The maniac was in prison, but this silhouette was too similar. Suddenly, the figure disappeared, dissolving into the night. I quickly closed all the doors and windows, feeling fear take hold of me again. But this time, I was ready. The next morning, I told Mike what I had seen. He reassured me that it could have been just a random passerby, but I could see the worry in his eyes. We decided to tighten up the security around the house to eliminate any possibility of break-in. A few days passed quietly, and I began to think that it was all just my imagination. But one night I heard the strange sound again, this time from inside the house. My heart was pounding in my chest as I cautiously walked out of the bedroom holding a flashlight and a knife. I moved slowly down the corridor, listening to every rustle. Suddenly I heard quiet footsteps behind me. I quickly turned around and shone my flashlight into a dark corner, but there was no one there. My paranoia was growing stronger with each passing second. I felt like someone was watching me. I returned to the bedroom, but sleep would not come. I lay there for several hours, listening to every sound. Suddenly, I heard a quiet knock on the window. Getting out of bed, I went to the window and saw a note attached to the glass from the outside. I quickly, "I'm here," the note said. My blood ran cold. Someone was playing with me, and I knew it was no accident. I immediately called Mike, and he arrived within minutes. We searched the house and the surrounding area, but found no trace of strangers. Mike offered to move in with him temporarily, and I agreed. We decided not to tell anyone about our plan so as not to scare off the pursuer. I took only the bare necessities and went to Mike's, but even in his house I did not feel safe. A week passed and I began to calm down a little. But one night, when I was alone, I heard a familiar sound, quiet steps behind the door. I grabbed a knife and quietly approached the door. Suddenly, the door slowly opened and I saw a shadow slip into the room. My mind screamed that this couldn't be real, but it felt too real. I stabbed the shadow with my knife, but it disappeared, as if it had dissolved into thin air. I was terrified. Something supernatural was happening, and I didn't know how to deal with it. When Mike returned, I told him what had happened. He was puzzled and suggested that we contact a paranormal expert. We contacted a well-known paranormal investigator who agreed to conduct an investigation at our home. The specialist arrived the next day and began the investigation. He installed cameras and sensors throughout the house. In the evening, we all gathered in one room waiting for the results. Suddenly, one of the sensors went off and the camera recorded movement in the hallway. We went to check what was going on there. In the darkness of the corridor, a silhouette of a man was visible. The specialist pointed a flashlight at him and we saw a face. It was the same maniac who had been arrested. But how was that possible? He had disappeared, leaving behind only a shadow. The specialist explained that we were dealing with something beyond our understanding. He suggested performing a cleansing ritual to get rid of this evil. We agreed, and the ritual was performed the next day. The house was cleansed, and we felt relief. But I knew that the nightmare was not over. The shadow of the maniac may disappear, but the fear he planted in my heart will remain forever. I decided to move to another city to start a new life, far from this nightmare. But every time I hear a rustle in the darkness, I remember those terrible nights, and only several months had passed since I moved to a new city, but the anxiety did not leave me. Despite all the precautions, the nights remained sleepless, and every rustle outside the window made me jump out of bed. I knew that I had to find a way to finally get rid of this fear. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a knock at the door. My heart sank. No one was supposed to come at this hour. I carefully approached the door and looked through the peephole. There stood a stranger in a long coat and a hat that hid his face. He started knocking harder, demanding that I open the door. I quickly grabbed my phone and called the police, reporting a suspicious person at my door. The stranger continued to knock, becoming more and more aggressive. Suddenly, he stopped and disappeared into the night. The police arrived a few minutes later and searched the area, but found no one. They advised caution and to contact them if the suspicious person returned. But I knew this was not just a random visit. The fear returned with renewed vigor. The next day, I decided to install additional cameras around the house and security systems. Every day, I looked through the recordings, hoping to find at least some trace of the stranger. Nothing suspicious happened, and I began to think that it was all a figment of my imagination. But one night, as I was sitting at my computer, I heard a rustling sound outside the window. I carefully approached and saw a dark figure slip into the shadows. I quickly turned on the camera footage and froze. On the screen was the same man in a raincoat and hat who had stood at my door. I decided not to wait for the next visit and called Mike. He arrived the next day, armed to the teeth and ready to help. We decided to set up an ambush, hoping to catch this stranger. Night fell and we took up positions, waiting for a shadow to appear. The hours dragged on slowly, but suddenly we heard quiet footsteps. The dark figure appeared at my house again, but this time it moved more confidently, as if it knew we were there. Suddenly the light flashed, and I saw his face. It was the same maniac who had been stalking me all these years. Mike lunged at him, but the figure disappeared like a shadow, dissolving into the night. We were both shocked. How was this possible? The maniac had been arrested, and now his ghost or something was haunting me. We realized that the fight was not over. We decided to resort to more radical methods. We contacted a well-known specialist in paranormal phenomena, who agreed to conduct a seance in my house. He said that we were dealing with a spirit that would not rest until it had fulfilled its mission. The specialist arrived and began preparing for the session. He explained that the spirit of the maniac was connected to the place where he was caught, and we should try to break this connection. Night came, and we began the session, holding candles and reading spells. Suddenly, the house began to shake and the light began to fade. A dark figure appeared in the corner of the room, its eyes gleaming with malice. The specialist continued to cast spells, but the figure came closer and closer. Fear gripped me, but I knew I had to hold on. At the last moment, the specialist threw something on the floor and the figure disappeared with a terrible scream. The house became quiet again. We were exhausted, but we knew this was an important step towards liberation. The specialist said that the spirit was weakened, but we needed to be prepared for a possible return. Several days passed and all was quiet, but one evening I heard the same rustling outside the window again. I froze, feeling the cold creeping into my bones. Had he really returned? I went to the window and saw a familiar figure standing in the shadows. My hand was shaking as I picked up the phone and dialed the specialist. He said this was the last time the spirit would try to return and we had to be ready. He arrived in the morning and we began preparing for the final session. Night fell and the house was filled with an oppressive silence. We began the seance and the shadows around us began to thicken. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared right in front of us, its face distorted with rage. The specialist chanted louder and louder, but the figure did not retreat. At that moment, I realized that I had to end this nightmare myself. I took the candle and walked up to the figure, feeling the fear recede. I looked straight into its eyes and told it that I was no longer afraid. The figure screamed and disappeared, leaving only a cold wind behind. The specialist said that the spirit was finally exorcised. I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I was finally free. We finished the session and the house was filled with light and warmth again. I knew that I had a long road to recovery ahead of me, but most importantly, I had conquered fear. Understand that I will never be truly free. A few weeks passed and I began to get used to a new life without fear. But one night when I was about to go to bed, I heard a strange sound from the basement. My heart began to beat faster. I took a flashlight and a knife and carefully went down. When I reached the basement door, the sound stopped. I slowly opened the door and started down the stairs. In the semi-darkness, I saw that the floor was covered with footprints, as if someone had walked barefoot back and forth. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and I heard quiet breathing behind me. I turned around abruptly but saw no one. My heart was pounding and I decided it was time to get out of the basement. But when I turned to the stairs, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, a quiet laugh was heard from the darkness. The laughter grew louder, becoming more sinister. I started screaming, demanding to be let out, but all I heard in response was this horrible laughter. Suddenly, I felt a cold wind and saw shadows sliding along the walls. They moved closer, enveloping me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to push away the fear. Suddenly, the laughter stopped and there was a dead silence. I opened my eyes and saw a hooded figure standing in front of me, her face hidden in shadow. She stared at me silently, and I felt the cold creep into my bones. "Why can't you leave me alone?" I screamed, but the figure remained silent. It slowly raised its hand and pointed at something behind me. I turned around and saw that there was an old photograph hanging on the wall. It was of the house I was currently living in, but it looked different. Much older. I came closer and saw the signature on the back, 1910. Suddenly, the figure disappeared, and the basement door opened by itself. I ran upstairs and locked the door. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were consumed by this strange photograph. The next day, I decided to find out more about my house. I went to the local library and started looking through the archives. It turned out that the house was indeed built in the early 20th century and belonged to a family that mysteriously disappeared. Their bodies were never found and the house remained empty for many years. My research led me to an old woman named Ethel who lived nearby and knew many stories about our town. She told me that the family who owned the house was involved in occult practices and performed strange rituals in the basement. Many believed that their disappearance was connected to dark forces. Ethel warned me that the house was cursed and that the spirits of the previous owners were not at peace. She advised me to leave before it was too late. I returned home, but the thought that my house was connected to something sinister did not leave me. I began to notice that things in the house were moving by themselves. Windows would open and close without my intervention, and at night I would hear footsteps in the attic. Fear began to take hold of me again, but I decided that I had to find out the truth and put an end to this nightmare. One night I gathered my courage and went up to the attic. It was dark and dusty. I shined a flashlight into every corner but found nothing unusual. Suddenly I noticed an old chest hidden behind some old boxes. I opened it and found old books and diaries. The journals belonged to the previous owners of the house. They described strange rituals they performed and their attempts to contact spirits. One of the journals ended by stating that they planned to perform a final ritual to free a spirit they believed was trapped in the house. I realized that the last ritual had not been completed, and that was why the spirits had not calmed down. I decided that I had to finish what the previous owners had started. The journal described the steps necessary to perform the ritual, and I began to prepare. Night came and I collected all the necessary items. I went down to the basement where I started to perform the ritual. Suddenly, strange things started happening in the house. Objects were flying around the room and I heard ominous voices, but I did not stop, continuing to read the spells. Suddenly, the same spirit I had seen earlier appeared. Its face was distorted with malice, and it began to approach me. I felt its power increase, but I did not stop the ritual. At the last moment, I cast the final spell and the spirit screamed, disappearing into a cloud of fog. The house became quiet again. I felt the tension ease and knew the ritual had worked. The spirits were no longer chasing me. I ran out of the basement and closed the door. I could finally breathe a sigh of relief. A few days passed and life began to return to normal. I no longer heard strange sounds or saw ominous figures. The house seemed calm and I hoped that the nightmare was finally over. But one night I woke up with a strange feeling that someone was watching me. I opened my eyes and saw a dark figure standing by the bed. It was the same spirit, but now it looked even more sinister. "You shouldn't have interfered," it whispered. I realized that the ritual hadn't been completed, and now I had to find a way to finally banish it. I contacted Ethel and told her what had happened. She said I had one last chance to find an old amulet that was hidden in the house. This amulet could banish the spirit forever. I began searching, turning over every corner of the house. Finally, I found the amulet in an old niche behind the fireplace. I felt its power protecting me. Night fell, and I went down to the basement again to perform the final ritual. I held the amulet and recited the spells, hoping for the best. The spirit appeared again. Its malice was indescribable. It began to attack me, but I held the amulet tightly and continued to chant. Suddenly, the spirit screamed and began to disappear, its figure dissolving into thin air. When the spirit finally disappeared, I felt an incredible sense of relief. The house was filled with light and warmth again. I knew that I was truly free now. I completed the ritual and closed the basement forever. Finally, I could begin a new life without fear. Several months passed, and I began to forget about all the horrors that had happened. I continued to live in the house, enjoying the peace and quiet. But one night, I woke up with a strange feeling that someone was watching me. I opened my eyes and saw a dark figure standing by the bed. It was the same spirit, but now it looked even more sinister. "You shouldn't have interfered," it whispered. I realized that the ritual hadn't been completed, and now I had to find a way to finally banish it. I contacted Ethel and told her what had happened. She said I had one last chance to find an old amulet that was hidden in the house. This amulet could banish the spirit forever. I began searching, turning over every corner of the house. I started looking for the amulet again, hoping that this would be my last chance to finally get rid of the spirit. After searching every corner of the house, I finally found it in an old chest in the attic. The amulet was made of a strange metal and emitted a faint glow. Night fell, and I knew the time had come. I gathered everything I needed for the final ritual and went down to the basement again. The house was silent, and every shadow seemed threatening. I held the amulet tightly in my hands, hoping it would help me deal with the spirit. As I began to cast the spells, the air in the basement grew cold, and I felt the presence of a spirit. A dark figure appeared before me, its eyes blazing with malice. "You cannot banish me," the spirit whispered, but I continued casting the spells without stopping. The figure began to approach, but the amulet flashed a bright light, and the spirit retreated, screaming in pain. I intensified the chanting, and the amulet began to emit an even brighter glow. The spirit screamed. Its figure began to blur, like fog dispersed by the wind. Suddenly, the house was filled with a bright light, and I felt the spirit disappear forever. The air became warm again, and silence enveloped the basement. I stood there, holding the amulet in my hands, realizing that it was finally over. The spirit was banished forever. I closed the basement and locked it forever, leaving all the horrors of the past behind. The house was filled with light and warmth again, and I began a new life without fear. Ethel congratulated me on my victory, saying that now I was truly free. I thanked her for her help and support. Months passed, and life returned to normal. I continued to live in the house, enjoying the peace and quiet. I no longer heard strange sounds at night, and the shadows no longer threatened me. I knew that I had finally conquered my fear and begun a new chapter in my life. Every day I woke up feeling free and grateful for having survived all these horrors. I realized that fear can be strong, but will and determination are stronger. Life became bright and filled with happiness again, and I was ready to look to the future with hope and confidence.